Thanks very much for inviting me. I think it's been a case of me being in the right place at the right time, really, and getting to really get my hands on lots of Hepworths over the last 11 years. And I'm hoping today to share with you some of my observations as a practitioner, really. My comfort zone really is right up on a ladder rather than presenting and talking in front of people, so bear with me. Also, I quite like the ladder. It features quite a lot in the talk, I have to say. There are quite a lot of them. It's a bit of an analogy, really, of how you approach your learning curve with Hepworths. Use different sources. We have our historical sources, we have the archive, we have scientific analysis. Sometimes that gives you 2 steps up and then you come down a few rungs when you're trying to put this into practice, because conservation really is an act of trial and error in lots of ways. And I'm either harnessed on, or I'm hemmed in and built into something, or I've got a mask on, and that's quite helpful because then you can't talk to people. If they ask you questions, you just do things. And actually, I think I've been asked to talk today because of my Hepworth mileage, and this is measured in the square inch per scrubbing with a toothbrush. And I've got a couple of rivals here, maybe in the audience, for my Hepworth mileage. And the best toothbrushes are the ones that your children have used, and they've been a bit worn down, and then they're small, you can get into crevices. Also, lots of shots of power tools. I often get help with my practice also. If it's a big project, we get other people involved. I think Tessa's over there. And that's really the beginning of this collaborative approach to research, where you bring in other people and you share your knowledge. This was a particular project that we completed on behalf of Tate a few years ago to restore Foursquare Walkthrough in St Ives in the garden. And it really is a culmination of lots of skill, knowledge and practice all put together. And this is a detail of the surface of Foursquare Walkthrough. There are few different areas of patternation, some are green and some are brown, but this is really to illustrate how corroded and porous and affected the surface has been through weathering over time. And once cleaned and all the old wax is removed and the corrosion is addressed and the bird poo is removed and the chewing gum scraped off, and you apply wax, you really get to actually see the surface of a Hepworth. I think as a conservator, we climb up and down, we get inside and out, we really get to know the sculptures. We literally see them from the top and the bottom and the insides. A really lovely moment on this particular work was where we revealed these beautiful little details from Hepworth's carving hammers. So she would make the initial sculptures in plaster, and then she would carve them, and she would use sandpaper, she'd use everything at her disposal to shape the surfaces. You should pour plaster on. You can see drips of plaster where they've become frozen once they're cast in bronze. But we were able at this point to pop over to the studio adjacent to the sculpture and find this particular tool which corresponds to the actual marks, and that was quite a good, rewarding moment for me. This is just to illustrate how the wire armature is the beginning of a sculpture, which is then progressed into some plaster, and then from that we get a bronze. And this particular plaster cast of hollow form within a form can be seen in the galleries at the moment, and I think it really does illustrate the difference in contrasts of textures which you would achieve with the plaster modelling. I'm starting with my wall of shame now. So this is one of the worst, most deteriorated sculptures I've ever come across. It belongs to Leeds Art Gallery. It doesn't look like this anymore, thankfully. It's partly in this state because it was displayed on top of a rooftop gallery right above a dual carriageway in Leeds, and it's possibly one of the most polluted places in the north of England. And you can see the sculpture's developed a really ugly black crust across its whole surface, and there's no contrast left anymore in that sculpture. This is an image of dual form from the Leeds Art Gallery catalogue as it entered the museum, and I hope you can see the difference in the qualities of the sculpture. These are some really horrible close-ups of the porosity that the sculpture's developed and the lines of the watermarks as they run down the surface. And these are steel casting pin holes or remnants that the bronze casters would fill with steel to prepare the sculptures. They often corrode really badly, and then they burst through the surface of the bronze and cause this kind of staining. And again, this is perhaps a good point to talk a little bit about corrosion and patination and the difference between weathering and an applied patina. So this sculpture here is where the original patina and where Hepworth would really have wanted a dark brown exterior and a light green interior has become really obscured by an acquired patina as it's weathered over time. If we look at the surface of Foursquare Walkthrough before it was conserved, we can see this natural patina as the original one has changed over time. As it's been exposed to atmospheric pollutants, it develops this very green, traditional verdigris kind of coloration. I've chosen this image of spring to talk a bit about applied patination because this is the Hepworth Estates cast, which I think is on show upstairs. This particular sculpture has never been shown outside, so it exists in its completely original state. And we can see here the really dark brown patina on the exterior and the green on the interior. An applied patina has been a process used since antiquity to decorate the surface of sculpture. Now, the solutions, the chemicals, the products they use are almost identical to actual natural weathering. It's just that it's done on purpose rather than done over time and over decades. And there have been really detailed scientific studies which show that these compounds which develop are almost exactly the same, so it's really hard to distinguish between them sometimes. And this brings me to a question I'd quite like to pose today about how sculptures change and how we should address this, or whether we should or not even. This is ascending form in its original location, which was outside the front of the gallery, and now it's been moved to the new Hepworth Garden. And it sits really near to a really beautiful Rebecca Warren sculpture, which is lovely and white. And we have really good evidence to suggest that the surface of ascending form should also be white and luminous, rather than the kind of khaki grey that it's become, that you can see in the photograph on the left, which is from the Hepworth Archive, the sculpture in the garden in 1960. If a string breaks or needs replacing, we would instantly replace it. It's integral to the sculpture. And this, I think, is interesting in terms of patination and colour, which we have difficulty in interpreting or deciding what to do with. This is the Arts Council Collection's version of Spring, and it had been the strings had been replaced with white strings a long time ago, and so I was commissioned by them to restring it. And I might play it again. This particular brown linen twine, cotton linen twine, was found in a warehouse in Liverpool in Kent & Co. They had previously been selling the white string. I happened to chat with the chap on the phone explaining what I was doing. He said, we've got lots of that old brown red string in the cupboard somewhere. It's not been used since the 60s when we'd send it down to St Ives, so that's a lovely little link there. I think Derek has written about the original strings, which were thought to be associated with the fishing industry in St Ives. And they were dyed using seaweed and different natural dye stuffs to become, I think it's called Derek, what's it called? I've forgotten, barking, like a dog. But it would make that particular dark red colouring. Here's another lovely photo of ascending form Gloria. Let's flip through. That was provided to me by the Hepworth Estate, and this was photographed somewhere between 1976 and 96. It still retains this very opaque white coloration. As conservators, we are very concerned with preserving the originality of a sculpture and the original surface. And this becomes very difficult when we really want to address some really radical change with the sculpture. For instance, this is hollow form within a form, and it's the first piece I restored for the Hepworth Wakefield. And in this instance, really, I just preserved what was there in the actual sculpture by enhancing the patina. And we can see how the application of wax with a hot blowtorch has really just saturated the original patina, and we've provided some insight into how it should look. So it's got the lovely contrasty green inside, which is very textured, and the exterior very brown, shiny surface. And this really is just preservation, in my view. We've not intervened much at all. We've just kept what's there. And this becomes far more difficult when a sculpture is so weathered and so disfigured and so non-representative of an artist's intent anymore. So that's dual form on the left in its weathered state, and then dual form on the right when it's been moved to Leeds University campus and underwent some quite interventive conservation, where I did actually replace the green patina on the surface, which felt essential in this instance. I'm going to go back to ascending form now, because this is one of the first commissions I undertook for the Arts Council collection. This version is situated up in Northumberland in Alnwick Gardens. And this is another version which I went to assess. It's in Longstone Cemetery in Carbis Bay, St Ives. And then, of course, we have our ascending form, which is situated at the front of the gallery. Just back to this one, actually. I was on site at Alnwick Gardens, and I was up a ladder again, and I was trying to conserve this work in 2 days or 3 days, whatever time I had. And I discovered this white residue on the surface, which I really couldn't explain. Actually, to be honest, I was up a ladder removing a huge wasp's nest, which had become embedded in the sculpture, and there were holes in the sculpture, and the wasps were in and out. And I was trying to deal with that, getting very confused because the wasp's nest material looked quite like the white residues, and it was a real mystery. I'd got 2 kids on tow also. They'd both got chicken pox. They're both under 5 and being looked after by grandparents, so it felt like everything was against me. But I knew enough to get in contact with the Hepworth estate and try and figure out what this residue was and how important and how integral it was to the sculpture. And thankfully, Sophie Bowness is just at the end of a phone call, and she's often there, I have to say. I imagine this red telephone in her office which lights up when there's a Hepworth in trouble. She's always full of information and so easy to approach and so helpful. I was really glad on that day because it was against all the odds, and it could have just all got removed. I'm being really honest now. Thankfully, we just preserved what was there, and then this started a whole investigation for myself personally into learning more about Hepworth's techniques and her processes, and looking at archive material. So this is ascending form again, and it's a photograph from inside the Trowin studio in January 1959. I was really lucky to be able to spend some time in the archive at Tate Britain looking at the letters from Hepworth, in particular looking for references to patternation. And in one particular letter, the foundry is in contact with her secretary, and they're discussing the use of a milk white for ascending form. And they also recommend that the sculpture can be collected when it's dry. That really, to me, suggested that this was far more than this wasn't our traditional patina, which was a chemical application. These generally dry instantaneously. And this is the first indication that this would be a paint layer, possibly. Another photograph. I'm just really going to keep showing you photographs of it looking white to get this message across. It just looks so opaque and so matte. And in another letter, Hepworth refers to the repatination of this bronze. So she's in correspondence again with her foundry, who say, "We have successfully completed the repatination of your bronze ascending form. Mr. Fresner and Mr. Hayter, who did the work last week, say that it now looks as well as our latest cast. They are no longer surprised that the city-living Japanese have to wear masks. The bronze had an atmospheric crust all over it." So these had been to Japan. They'd come back completely unrepresentative of what Hepworth wanted, and she repatinated them, which is a really, for me, a great insight into her thinking and how she would have addressed this. This is my favourite letter because she comments, it's lovely to be able to read her letters and start to understand her tone and her interest and her attention to detail, and that comes through when you get to spend time with this material. And she's referring again to the exhibits in Tokyo, and she says, the bronze has only been twice in 2 sculpture parks. The atmosphere must be incredibly polluted, and I shudder to think what the big bronze they brought from me is like. I don't know which that big bronze is. Sophie, would you know? Okay. But again, I liked to hear that tone, which you can tell in the letters, where she really cares what they look like, and will take steps to address that even in her own lifetime. We had some scientific analysis done by X-ray diffraction on the white residues, and this analysis revealed that it contained calcite, rutilite and dolomite. This was performed at Imperial College by Richard Sweeney, and he could confirm from this analysis that this really is consistent with 1960s and 70s household paint preparations of the time. It'd be really lovely to be able to get further analysis done using FTIR, which will examine the organic components of the remnants also. Oh, I can't see that. Also, Sophie Bowness recently sent me a lovely correspondence between a collector in America regarding the treatment of her sculpture, Patmos, which is a similar white-coloured sculpture. And Hepworth advised us on how she should treat this. She says, I'm very sorry to hear that the atmosphere where you live has an ill effect on Patmos. My own copy in the garden is, of course, entirely immaculate because I have ideal clean air and no diesel fumes. I think the patina was obtained by milk and lime, which may be vulnerable to a polluted atmosphere. And I would suggest that you brushed it with a very small suede brush, and that then you get help from a good craftsman to paint it all over with a white atmosphere-resistant paint. And immediately before it sets, rub all the surfaces clean, leaving only the white crustaceans in the hollow. This, I think, would be impervious to pollution. It would not be difficult, providing an intelligent man rubbed off the surfaces, leaving only white in the crevices. She goes on to say, interestingly, the alternative would be to let it take its course in your atmosphere. By washing it and waxing it, it would then, no doubt, take on new colour and a pattern of all of its own. So here we can hear 2 voices and two attitudes to the sculptures, whether they change or not. She seemed to be accepting of both. In regards to her colour and patination and use of paint surfaces, we can see on 2 figures here the blue areas and the green areas, obviously quite thick, opaque paint applications. The one from the family of man, and it's from 1970s. Just check what I'm talking about here. Ah, yes. And here I wanted to refer to the polished edges on the sculptures, which are basically exposed areas of bronze, which must have been lacquered, I would say, to preserve those areas. And we can see that on the 4-square walkthrough, which we restored a few years ago. And this is where I need notes. Tate Gallery Conservation Department, the Science Conservation Department, did analyse some of these lacquers to reveal that they contained yellow ochre pigments. So Hepworth herself would colour her own lacquers. And there's a really excellent body of work called From Marble to Chocolate, which I'd recommend anybody to read, where Derek Pullen and Sandra Dayton, they did an inventory of the Hepworth studio and found lots of paints with Dulux and Magicoat and lots of colours. And they also found dried up jam jars with different lacquers, and that's what was analysed. So these are another really rich area of resource. I think Melanie's going to talk about a more recent inventory of the studio also. I wanted to talk a little bit how colour is very subjective. This is my daughter's sketch of 4-square walkthrough. She's in the corner there, which is the very first time I examined it. I think she was 6. And I love the way she talked about the light on the sculpture. And then I'm diverting here, but I just wanted to include this quote from Hepworth, which says, perhaps what one wants to say is formed in childhood, and the rest of one's life is spent trying to say it, which is, I just think, really revelatory, really lovely. And I think this whole interpretation of colour is incredibly subjective. even Hepworth herself writes about how it was more of a transient feeling on an emotion rather than an actual colour. She writes, I've been very influenced by the natural colour and luminosity in stones and woods, the change in colour as light travels over the surface and contour. When I pierced the material right through, a great change seemed to take place in the concavities from which the direct light was excluded. From this experience, my use of colour developed. One more, it's the last drawing, but it's my daughter's drawing of river form, where she really did capture the light on the sculpture, the water it collected, the sunlight, the rainbows, the things she was talking about, I thought was just really quite special. And then on the right is river form, again from one of the Marlborough Fine Art catalogues. Here I wanted to talk about how saturated the colours are in these particular publications. And they were, in the 60s and 70s, these photographs would have been taken on C-type film, slide film. And once they're reproduced in catalogues of this era, it's called Cibachrome or Kodachrome printing, they become this incredibly oversaturated and slightly unrealistic colour. And I thought this was a great illustration of Barbara Hepworth's red trousers and the contrast with her top. And it just shows this hyperreal kind of colour, which we can't be that trustworthy, we can't really take for granted. If you think of John Hind photography at the side, the postcard photography at the time, he had some very red areas and really sort of different colours. And then on the right, it just struck me, the colour combination was so similar with one of her first coloured sculptures, a sculpture with colour blue and dark red. Hepworth was really very involved with the foundry application of patiners. She often chose to change them herself afterwards. There were a fantastic collection of patina samples which were sent to Hepworth from her foundry, and they're upstairs in the galleries and the drawers. If you get a chance to look at them, they're really fantastic. And I think Hepworth actually did, as we all do in a way, think that the big bronzes should be quite robust and they should weather and they should be able to be handled. And she says of the public, I'd like them to identify themselves with them or give them a pat, her sculptures, by the way. I think every sculpture must be touched. It's part of the way you make it, and it's really our first sensibility. So this is all very well, but when it's amplified by several 100,000 visitors a year, and you get school groups who come like swarms towards you as you're trying to assess some sculptures, it becomes a real problem. As kids, they're interactive, they were meant to be. It's such a shame, but when it's literally hundreds of kids every year, the pattern has become eroded away, right down to polishing the bronze. You can see in the close-ups on the right, where the interior of that sculpture is completely eroded away, and it's become bright and polished rather than a green interior patina. So this is quite handy in a way, because for this project you can see some of the erosion of the bases here in particular, and you can see that these sculptures have been routinely waxed over years and years, and they've become really just one amorphous colour rather than a real contrast. But because of the actual damage, it meant we could really step in and restore these sculptures to how we think they should have originally been viewed. Again, we get a little note from Hepworth, who says, when she was looking for a place to originally house the family of man, she wrote that I feel very loath to drop the family of man through a hatch in a warehouse where they could not be seen or even weathered in the proper way that they should. I think even Hepworth would have been surprised at the amount of weathering that these things could encounter over so many years. And these are some nice illustrations of the family of man as it's being constructed. So we have the aluminium armature, we have the application of the plaster, and then we have the finished sculptures. I'm going to get this completely wrong because I don't have my notes, but the family man, there are 9 units in 6 editions, and this is a photograph from my Marlborough catalogue again, because I love it and it's so informative. these were installed outside the Morris Singer Foundry in Basingstoke. And there are only 2 full sets of the family of man, one at the Yorkshire Sculpture Park, and the other one is at the Donald M. Kendall Sculpture Garden in Purchase, New York. And you can see from both these illustrations the contrast between the dark brown exteriors and then the green interiors. This is an illustration of the wax removal while we were treating these sculptures, and you can see the thick build-up on the I can't even do left and right now. Okay, this side is very black, and once the wax build-up is removed, you can really start to discover the rich texture from some of the original patination. So it's really more a case of liver of sulphur brown, some greens and some golds. There is a real three-dimensional kind of build-up there. This is Lindsay and I applying some of the patination. So we did actually intervene again and we repatinated the loss of the green areas. Sophie Bowness gave us the exact recipe for the patination solution, which included calcium carbonate, which would give it opacity, and it really does work. And it's a cold patiner, so it can be applied outside and it can be applied on site, and it does react actually really, really well. It's amazing. It's almost like a paint. It's not a paint because it does actually react with the surface, but it was really quite magical. So this is why Hall of Fame now. We've done the Wall of Shame. This is the Hall of Fame. And we've got Ultimate Form before, where it's very obscured by the build-up of wax and a general treatment all over. And then after conservation, we can see the contrasts, and some of the gold edging is revealed. It's not been repolished, but it's been revealed once again. This is Ancestor 1. And actually, the landscape, all the sculptures were moved on site so that the whole area could be re-landscaped. This is Ancestor 2. Parent 1. Hope I've got this right, Sophie. I get them mixed up so many times. There are so many of them, and every time you try and count them, you get them wrong. Here's a close-up of the gold edging on Parent 1, where it almost looks like it's been ground away. It's been patinated and then ground and polished. And Parent 2. And this is Bridegroom and Bride, Youth and Young Girl. This is an overall shot, and then some lovely autumn day, just bright and lovely ones. And then thankfully there were 3 more just down the road. So this is the family of man, which were originally in Wakefield Town Centre, and now you can see them on the riverbank just outside the gallery. This is a postcard that I found on eBay that I just wanted to share because it's so hideous, and I'm not sure if they're trying to show the clock tower or all the sculptures here, but it's just a really interesting little shot. So, family of man in Wakefield, before and after. It looks like I photoshopped the after sky, doesn't it? But I haven't. That's just everything had improved greatly after the treatment. This is a close-up, a detail of how eroded and weathered they'd actually become. They'd not been waxed or maintained in many years, but even in this eroded state, where you can see black crust accumulation and you can see the water rivulet marks. Even in this state, some of the actual original patination is largely there, because once it's saturated with wax, which is what the foundry would have done anyway, they'd always wax a surface once it's been produced. You can see the half and half here of just the hot waxing. So I did replace the green areas of patination, but the dark areas are really just enhanced with wax and heat, and it just bring that richness again. It restores that richness. And there's a nice bird's eye view and the ladder again. And this is the pattern application, which we of course made tests prior to doing it. You use a stippled brush, which you put on, and then you use a brush to take it off, and use really, really, really tiny amounts of the solution. It doesn't take much. And here they are after, in lovely sunlight, which we've got today, which we don't often get in Wakefield, but we do. And this is the treatment of dual form in Leeds University. So these are the before photographs, and this is the Patternation application, and this is the after shot, and some more after shots. And then this is dual form, which is at the Guildhall in St Ives, and these are the before shots. There are always birds around. When I'm doing a treatment, there are birds around, and I think there's more to them than just being birds. I'm sure somebody's looking down on me or trying to G me on or check out what I'm doing. And these are the after shots. And I'd just really like to add in a few now of the treatments that I've been able to do because of my relationship with the Hepworth Wakefield and the exhibitions that they've curated and created, and the Hepworths that have come to this area again, which weren't here before. So this is Galliard, and it was owned by the Wakefield Grammar School, the girls' grammar school, and it's made from sheet metal, and it had accumulated a lot of tarnish. And here's after. It's a bit bright, to be honest, but it will tarnish down. As it oxidises, it has a protective surface. I don't get to see them very often, even a few days after the treatment. As soon as it's finished, it gets ferried away. But this is an after shot. And this is hieroglyph, which is in Leeds Art Gallery collection. This is a halfway through treatment where you can see the accumulation of dirt. And here you can see the colours from the stone have really come through after removal of the dirt. Our antiphon, here we go, it links up with Michael's now, but I think that's a better bush photo, don't you? Because actually, when we went to see it, I was with the estates team and we walked past it about 3 times, so we just couldn't see it. There was lots of ivy on the wall and it just blended in. I'm not sure if I've got a photo of the signature. No, I haven't. I was going to try and resolve your signature or make your mark thing, but I can't. This just shows the extent to things that can happen to the sculptures when they're, especially in vegetation, and they're near places where birds will sit. So there's a lot of bird lime. It's quite disfiguring. And this is antiphon during treatment. I was using the facilities at the Yorkshire Sculpture Park. And finally, this is a sculpture which Ellen and I went to see recently, potentially for the next exhibition at the Hepworth. It's called Oval Form Tresion. It's at Abbott Hall Art Gallery in Kendal. And again, this one has been quite severely eroded over time. It's in a very exposed place, but we could still detect some of this white build-up in the crevices, which can be confusing because it really can look like a mistake because it's been so eroded. But looking at some of the photographs that Sophie Bowness sent me, we can see that there really is perhaps a treatment of the interior with this white substance, and it's not on the exterior in the same way. I think it's particularly visible on this sculpture. And of course, all the casts were treated very differently. We can't magically come up with a formula for one looking at several casts. They're all very different, and each one's very individual. This is my website, and it's me. But I think the last thing I'd like to reiterate, I'm sorry I've lost my notes, and I think I've left lots out, I'm afraid. I didn't lose my notes, they just didn't come up. But I would like to pose the question about ascending form, which sits outside the front of the gallery. It sits next to the Rebecca Warren, which is white and luminous. And I wonder what we should do to ascending form, which sits next to it. Would Barbara Hepworth be happy with its current state and it's developing a different pattern, as she does suggest in her letter, or would she prefer it to be repatinated? Just this week, I've got a new thing from eBay. I love eBay, it's brilliant, but you find little catalogues which you wouldn't normally get access to, with a great photo of ascending form, which you could come and have a look at maybe in a minute, which is very vivid and has that sort of rubbed down look. Something perhaps which is, could be discussed. Thank you.